Welcome to HughesTechCon's Track 3. It's my pleasure to present to you the new talk here. So, cyber disasters and proactive cyber defense strategy. Our first speaker for Track 3 is a management consultant and researcher in cybersecurity, IT, and data analytics. Over the last 2 decades, he's been a cyber risk consultant in the U.S. to several multinational corporations in financial services, healthcare, oil and gas, manufacturing, and technology. Please help me welcome Dr. Joseph Ponnoly.
Good morning, everyone. So the topic for discussion today is cyber disasters. The reason why I chose this topic is because I just completed my doctoral dissertation in this area, and I was researching on why organizations fail to foresee the coming of cyber disasters. So you are familiar with recent cyber disasters like the Colonial Pipeline attacks or the SolarWinds hack, and most recently we had the MGM cyber attack. So all these disasters were surprise, unanticipated events. So the question was, why did organizations or even the state, the country, the nation, why did they fail in foreseeing these events? Same was the case with other major disaster that we have seen, the COVID pandemic. No one saw it coming. So the question was, where was the failure? These cyber disasters, they have a lot of things in common with other disasters. The global financial crisis, or even the 9/11, or the COVID pandemic, BP oil slick, and so on. So what we find is all these disasters, they have the human factors, they are responsible for it. And the human factor is the decision-making failures, the managerial failures. And that happens because of system failures. So I'm referring to these 3 books, Cyber Crisis by Eric Cole. Eric Cole, he worked with NSA for a long time, and he came out with this book in 2021. He has cautioned us that the world is already in World War III. It is a cyber war, which is silent, stealthy, and that is being fought by the major cyber superpowers, USA, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and their allies. So it is a global war, which is silent, which is taking place on a day in and day out. But organizations and nations fail to identify these major cyber war-like attacks. We have seen that in Ukraine, and we are now seeing that in the Hamas-Israel conflict. So it is extending to Iran and the Arab countries. So what Eric Cole has cautioned us is that we should be prepared for it, and nations are not prepared for it. Brad Smith, in his book, Tools and Weapons, Brad Smith, as you know, is the president of Microsoft. He has detailed the evolving technology landscape, new technologies. We have heard the keynote speaker speaking about artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. There are a whole lot of other technologies which are coming into the fray. And we are already in the digital age, and we are soon moving into the quantum computing era. So new technologies, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, industrial Internet of Things, 3D manufacturing, blockchain technologies, the whole slew of technologies that are surfacing. But Brad Smith cautions us that there are perils of these technologies because cyber criminals and nation states who use cyber criminals as mercenaries, they can prevent the complete use of these technologies on a global scale, they can subvert the progress of humankind with the emerging technologies. The third book that came up in 2019, Andy Greenberg, he has written in detail about the cyber war the cyber war era that is emerging. And that happened right from 2007 when Russia invaded their allies, Georgia and Estonia, in Eastern Europe, and they unleashed the era of cyber war. In 2017, the world saw the WannaCry ransomware attack, and immediately following that, the NotPetya ransomware attack. The NotPetya ransomware attack, it's originated in Ukraine, and then it spread to the whole world, UK, USA, and it hit major corporations in US and also in UK and Europe. And the estimated loss was considered to be around 50 billion. So what does all these indicate? That we are already in the era of cyber warfare, and the threat actors, are nation states and organized cyber criminals. Okay. And as I mentioned, these disasters, including cyber disasters, they indicate management failures involving system failures and decision failures. This was also evident in the case of as you know, the Boeing 73 MAX disasters. So it resulted in the death of nearly 346 people. And Boeing introduced this new airplane and sold it to over 1,000 customers. And they had improved their software to automate redirecting the plane when there is a sudden dive. The software, the sensors will identify the diving position, and then it will automatically correct the course and bring the airplane to the desired direction. But unfortunately, this software was not told to the pilots. They were not trained in it. They were only told that this is a new airplane and they could fly it. And in the case of the airlines in Indonesia and Ethiopia, where the accidents happened, the plane immediately after takeoff, it started diving down, and then the pilots, they tried to correct it, but the software did not function. And all it happened because there were supposed to be two sensors, and the management decided that only one sensor was enough, and that sensor failed. And the pilots were not trained. So the investigation by the transport agency, the federal agency, they found that there was managerial failures, both by Boeing as well as by Federal Aviation Administration. So these disasters again indicated that there was system and decision-making failures. So why did they fail? So ultimately, we find that they did not heed to the warning signs. In all these cases, whether it was normal disasters like a pandemic or even these cyber disasters, there were warning signs. These warning signs were not heeded. And the question was how to sense these warning signs and how to make sense of these warning signals of these disasters. So my research identified some of the bottlenecks or some of the challenges in sensing these warning signs and making sense of these warning signs. Sensing is because the landscape, the IT landscape is constantly evolving, new technologies are surfacing, and the threat landscape is automatically also is evolving, it is dynamic. And we are dealing with very sophisticated threat actors who are supported by nation states. And the technological complexity leads to cascading control failures. Control-based assessments, they are not helping organizations, the compliance-based assessments. So what organizations need to focus on is identifying the risks and threats which are unknown. And there are resource constraints. From the decision-making point of view, the business-centric security, business and IT and security, they don't see eye to each other. And there is siloed thinking, siloed operations. There are leadership failures in this. And managers, in making decisions, they have to deal with deep uncertainty, and they are not prepared for that. So what is required is to have a proactive cyber defense posture by organizations, and that requires them to consider cyber disaster preparedness, understanding the cyber disasters and the emerging threats and the risk landscape, and knowing how to sense and make sense of these warning signs. And that takes us to knowledge-based strategies. So with data analytics becoming more common today, analytics-based or more robust, what is known as the robust decision-making models, they can be employed by decision makers to make better decisions, to be better prepared for these cyber disasters. So on the left, you see what is called the Sendai Disaster Risk Framework. So after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency, they came up with this framework in 2015. The Fukushima disaster was in 2011. And they have recommended that there must be decrease in the impact, loss of human lives, financial loss, and organizational and nationwide impact of these disasters. Not only natural disasters like floods and typhoons and so on, human-engineered disasters. And human-engineered disasters are examples are cyber disasters and terrorism. So there must be decrease in the impact of this and increase in the capability of nations and organizations to deal with this. So increase in the capability means implementation of warning systems. So what they recommend is multi-hazard warning systems. So what we require is a cyber early warning system. So my research focused on sensing and sense-making of these warning signs, and then formulated a strategy for proactive cyber defense, which is based on a cyber early warning system. So as I mentioned, cyber disaster preparedness requires sensing of the warning signs, and there we have to deal with the threats, the emerging threats, the unknown threats, and also the systemic risk. And we find that current risk assessment methodologies, they fail in identifying the systemic risk and the system fragilities. And in sense making, the decision makers, they have to deal with decision making under deep uncertainty. So coming to system failures, we find that current risk management methodologies and approaches fail against these unknown threats and risks. The reason is organizations, they focus on compliance-based strategies for risk assessments, and they're dealing with qualitative and quantitative methodologies which are based on known threats. So even the fair risk assessment methodology, which is a quantitative risk assessment methodology, that doesn't deal with the unknown threats. So how to deal with these unknown threats? Again, we have to deal with the warning signs. So this threat assessment, threat modeling, that is an area which is overlooked by organizations in assessing risk. We have various security operations teams dealing with various SIM tools and XDR, MDR tools, and so on. But there again, they are dealing with the playbooks. They don't deal with, or they are not considering the unknown threats, the threats which are evolving, the surprise attacks by sophisticated threat actors, which are the nation states. So threat modeling, understanding the threat actors, as I mentioned, now it is nation states and organized cyber criminals of the cyber underworld, the dark net, who are dealing with an economy which is $1 trillion economy. So they can develop new technologies, AI-based ransomware, crypto ransomware, and ransomware as a service, and so on. So we are dealing with those threat actors, and the threat landscape also is evolving in this dynamic with new technologies which are evolving, and those technologies are being abused by these threat actors. So AI, now we have AI-based malware. AI malware that is created using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, the deep fakes, and so on. With quantum computing emerging, we will find that our cryptographic controls, they will be ineffective. So our defenses are one step behind these threat actors and their mechanisms and their technologies. And the threat vectors, currently we are seeing ransomware attacks, but advanced persistent threat attacks, they are what is more dangerous. So in the case of Colonial Pipeline attack, not Colonial, the SolarWinds hack, they were able to infiltrate into the networks of SolarWinds, and they were able to inject the Trojan into the Orion software. And the Orion software was being used by nearly 38,000 customers. So it is surprising that when these updates were happening, many of these organizations, or probably none, identified that there was a Trojan in that. So all these attackers, they are using these APT-based attacks and also zero-day exploits, for which our malware defenses are not helpful. Now, with AI-based threats and deepfakes, we have to be concerned about the new threat vectors. So these emerging threats, we have to consider these and focus on what is called organizational threat modeling. So threat modeling for each organization will be different. So each organization must consider their technologies, their business objectives, and so on. The PASTA model is now popular for developing organizational threat modeling. It focuses on the businesses, the business objectives, and the technical scope, or the infrastructure, the application software dependencies, then decomposes the applications using data flow diagrams and trust boundaries, considering all the assets and services, the roles and data sources, and then uses attack scenarios analysis. Again, it is probabilistic. So I will discuss why probabilistic technologies are not helpful against these unknown attacks. But for the time being, probabilistic attack scenarios analysis is sufficient here. And then they do the vulnerability analysis, enumerating the abuse cases and design flow analysis and using threat trees, and then do the attack surface analysis, and then come to mitigation strategies. So threat modeling, that has to be supplemented by threat hunting and threat intelligence. Now we have tools for this, and they use artificial machine learning and deep learning for behavioral analysis, but those are just tools to aid the decision makers for making better decisions. So what is important is to capture the warning signs, and that may be the needle in the haystack. With big data analytics, as we will see soon, we should be able to have insights into big data, massive volumes of data to identify the needle in the haystack of the threats. Now, since that was about the threat scenario and threat modeling, equally important is sensing the systemic risk. So in risk assessments, what is done is the scoping is too narrow to identify one part of an environment or organization. So when we consider systemic risk, we are rolling up rolling up the component level risk into the enterprise level risk. So here we are dealing with complexity. Systems are complex and they function in a non-linear fashion. They don't function in a linear fashion. So in complexity and non-linear relationships, we find that it is the component level risk may be different from the enterprise level risk. So rolling up all these risks and having a holistic view of the risk at the enterprise level, that will help organizations to identify the system, not only the system weaknesses, but also the system fragilities. So fragility assessment is something which is to be thought of to supplement the normal risk assessment methodologies. So what is important is to have systems thinking, considering the complex systems. And system thinking in a non-linear world that requires us to consider these complex systems and their adaptability, the interconnectedness of these things. So in many cases, we find that organizations, they don't consider their systems connected to external systems. A typical case was, I was consulting for a food supply company here, and their operations were stalled for, or they were disrupted for nearly 1 week, all because they were dependent on other organization, which was a global meat supplier, and that global meat supplier, they experienced ransomware attacks and their systems failed and they were non-operational for 1 week. So this system here, or this organization, they did not think beyond the boundaries of their organizations to see the connectedness of the exterior systems. So that is where their organizations have blind sides. And that is one of the reasons the threat actors, they are able to effectively implement or they create all these disastrous attacks on these organizations. So warning signs must consider these vulnerabilities and system fragilities, and they should be able to identify the fragility of these systems, where these systems can break up. System fragility assessment, as I mentioned, must consider that complex quadrant and also the chaotic quadrant of systems within organizations. What we really do now is deal with the simple known knowns or the known unknowns or the knowable ones, simple and complicated. Those are the areas we are focusing in our risk assessments and threat assessments. We don't deal with the complexities and chaotic nature of the systems that can fail. To do fragility assessments, what is required is to identify the tipping points, and the vulnerability assessments must include systems analysis, interactions, dependencies, the feedback loops and the bottlenecks, and disruptions with controls having control failures with cascading effects. And also must consider the impact of technological changes, market shifts, regulatory changes, and the internal and external issues. So even the organizational culture, leadership, resource constraints, all these are factors which are to be considered as risk factors. Then fragility assessment also must consider whether the organization has resilience to these disruptions. So resilience management is equally important. So risk and resilience management, having backup. So if there is a ransomware attack, can the organization bounce back? So how resilient it is? Yes. Tipping point is the system suddenly breaking down. So Taleb, who mentioned about black swan effect, he mentions the turkey effect. So the turkey is always feeling safe because it is well fed, so there is no risk to the turkey. And suddenly we have a Thanksgiving Day, and then the turkey is suddenly there is a disruption. So that is the breaking point, the tipping point. Systems which can suddenly break, the breaking point of systems, that is what is to be considered. So fragility assessment is something which should be thought of to supplement risk assessments. So the enablers of sensing these warning signs from considering the systemic failures, so we have to focus on threat detection through threat intelligence and organizational threat modeling and log management using big data analytics. And all these SIM solutions, they can also supplement these efforts in threat detection. But we should go one step beyond that. That is what we'll be discussing next, the human factor and decision-making factor. In sensing systemic risk, the architecture is also equally important. Defense in depth and normal cyber hygiene is equally important. But there we have to go beyond that in identifying the fragilities and use fragility assessments. Asset management is also important. Assets which are which have internet, which are internet facing, as IT and OT interfaces, and internal and external interfaces, and assets of all kinds, the network devices, systems, and people. People are also assets, the resource constraints, all these must be considered. And vulnerability management should go one step beyond with systemic view and systemic analysis. So we have seen in disasters, systemic failures happen, but the major concern is the decision failures. And that is because decision makers at all levels, whether it is the operational level or tactical level or strategic level, they have to deal with decision making under deep uncertainty. And the major challenges are, of course, the risk and the fragility, and considering the disasters and crisis. So as Eric Cole mentioned, it is not a question as to when an organization or when a nation will be hit. They will always be hit. Not whether they will be hit, but when they will be hit. So organizations must be prepared for crises and disasters, which they don't do. They have a blind side and say, okay, we will cross the bridge when it happens. Then decision makers, they have these blinkers on, they have their biases, and there is inconsistency or noise. What Kahneman is a behavioral economist who received the Nobel Prize for decision-making biases, the prospect theory. And he mentions that human beings are not rational in their decision-making, and the irrationality arises because of the managerial blind sides, the biases, and the noise not only in the inconsistency of the decisions, but also the systemic noise. And in all these, when we deal with uncertainties and deep uncertainty, the unknowns, there is the question of knowledge and ignorance, that is non-knowledge, the lack of ignorance, which usually we don't acknowledge. So these are the decision-making challenges when dealing with deep uncertainty. And deep uncertainty arises because of the complexity and chaos in systems, and the need is to consider the systems as adaptive. In normal organic systems, they are self-adaptive, but in human systems, human-centric cyber-physical systems, that adaptiveness has to be created. That is why interventions are required to reduce the complexity of systems, their interactions, their interfaces, and the connectivities and interactions. So IBM, they came Kurtz and Snowden worked with IBM, and he came up with the Quiven sense-making framework to deal with decision-making under complexity and chaos. That is also helpful for decision makers, but essentially it means that there must be sensing and sense-making and probing and analyzing before making decisions. The managerial blind sides, they were indicated by Kahneman and Tversky in their prospect theory. And decision-making biases can introduce risks and fragilities, and that can lead to decision-making failures. So what are the knowledge enablers? For sensing, as mentioned, the vulnerability assessments, vulnerability management and defense in depth, asset management, architecture, as I mentioned, and detection of threat events helps us in sense the impending threats and risks. But for decision-making or sense-making of these warning signs, we need to have knowledge-based strategies based on analytics, data analytics, expert advice, and developing a cyber early warning systems, and then using what is called the robust decision-making. Cyber disaster strategy, disaster preparedness strategy must be there, and it must be part of the cyber governance and IT governance framework and the organization, the enterprise risk governance organization. And enterprise, the risk must be rolled up to the enterprise level, not at the component level or at the operational level. And there must be resiliency involving business continuity and disaster recovery. And always the human factor must be considered, because people are the weakest link when we consider defense in depth. And human factor involves employees and also the managers. Decision-making failure is also a risk factor. So how to make better decisions? So data analytics. So we now focus on predictive analytics. So the keynote speaker spoke about AI-based machine learning techniques for dealing with massive volumes of data. So that only helps us to get insights into the data. So there is a new field called prescriptive analytics. So the outputs from predictive analytics, whether it is deep learning, machine learning, and so on, they should give options to the decision makers to make better options. So there is no question of an optimized decision making in a complex situation. So we have various options, then the decision makers and the stakeholders, they must collaborate and make decisions on evaluate the various options and identify a better option from the various options. So better decision making, a better option model. That is what is considered in robust decision making. So that involves scenario planning and simulations and so on. And the systemic thinking is also required, as mentioned earlier. Even for decision makers, they should have a holistic view of their organization, the systems, interactions, and connectivity, and so on. So here, decision makers have to think beyond probabilities. So most of the decisions are made on probabilistic analysis. So probability takes into consideration past data and known data. So probabilistic thinking, that doesn't apply, or it fails in the face of unknown data, when you don't have past data. So disasters, you don't have data of pandemic. Of course, in early 90s, we had a pandemic, but they were unknown, or these situations are totally different from the COVID pandemic was different from that. So when you don't have past data, when the threats are unknown, how do you make decisions? So that is where the logic of abductive thinking has to be applied. Abductive thinking is different from normal deductive or inductive thinking. In deductions, we have some theories or frameworks, and we extend that to new situations. And in inductive thinking, you have a lot of data, and then you identify the patterns in the data. So when you don't have data, the technique that is adopted by, say, physicians when they diagnose diseases, they start with nothing. Then they hypothesize, they take evidence, they do a lot of tests, they experiment, and then they come up with new hypotheses, they refine their hypothesis. The same method, abductive method, is used by scientists for their discoveries, by explorers when they explore new areas, Columbus or Vasco da Gama, when they entered into new unknown territories, uncharted territories. The same technique is used by criminal investigators. So I was a criminal investigator, so I can say that we start from scratch, from first principles. So that is abductive thinking. That is something which has to be wired into the brain of decision makers. Start everything without biases, start everything from scratch, ask questions. Have we considered everything? Have we left out anything? Is it true? Is it more probable? What about this? What about that? Those sort of questions are not being asked, and decision makers, very often they don't like to be challenged. They are autocratic and they make decisions, impose their decisions on the system. Decisions must be challenged, and there must be possibility for challenging these decisions. So these are some of the techniques for better decision making. So what is required is to go beyond what is known to what is not known, what is ignorance, to acknowledge that there are areas we don't know, and we need more information about that, and probing and analyzing to get more information when there is ignorance. Prescriptive analytics, as I mentioned, goes beyond predictive analytics to identify better decision-making options based on the insights from predictive analytics. So now organizations have chief data operators, officers. They must support these strategic decision-making based on predictive analytics. So all these tools can be helpful for decision makers, predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics. And that is where decision making has to be a cooperative effort, not a single man's decision. So robust decision making is a new approach that is proposed by RAND Corporation to deal with decision making, getting better decision making under deep uncertainty. So there, the focus is not on the binary decision, yes or no, but decision as to what is a better decision. So that requires what if analysis, what is called the scenario planning, understanding various scenarios, and then considering the risk relating to that, doing a trade-off analysis and a vulnerability analysis on the various options, and then using various simulations like Monte Carlo simulations and so on, that can help decision makers in robust decision making. So this is some sort of planning, some sort of a data flow for robust decision making. So it is participatory decision making. The scopes and the cases are generated, and then the various scenarios are explored and discovered, the vulnerabilities are identified, and then the trade-off is analyzed, and then a robust strategy is created, and that is discussed with the stakeholders. So, and then finally a decision is made, which is a better decision, not the optimized decision. So this, as applied to cyber risk scenarios, the early warning systems, they can identify the possible attacks, not the probable attacks. So are we prepared for the possible attacks from cyber criminals? And the FAIR methodology can give a quantitative analysis of that using Monte Carlo simulations. The risk and impact can be measured, and then the risk treatment options can be arrived at. So we are going beyond probabilities to abductive thinking to to the realm of possibilities, and that requires some sort of a creative imagination. So managers must be scientific as well as they should have a creative imagination, and they must use abductive thinking, exploring plausible and possible scenarios, and thinking like a rocket scientist, and start from first principles without any data, without any preconceived notions. So creating a risk and intelligent risk immune organizations must consider people, process and technologies and identify risks and fragilities, and leadership holds the key. Unless there is a leadership top management commitment to this, then everything can fail. And defense in depth is also important. So risk and system fragility must be considered when there is a controls framework and resilience framework. So the compliance course of internal controls framework or many of the compliance efforts, they are focused on controls. So controls must consider not only the technology controls, but process and people-oriented controls and human factors. And they must be, controls must be aligned to the risk and fragilities, and risk and fragilities must consider the resilience also. So what does proactive cyber defense ultimately mean? It means that we must heed to the cyber early warning systems using organizational threat modeling, using risk and fragility assessments, also focusing on resilience management, and having threat intelligence and threat hunting in security operations, and using a defense strategy which is based on scenario planning and simulations. So what I came up with is this proactive cyber defense framework. So what is in blue is what is the current stage. So we have the assets, then we do risk management, then we focus on the risk mediation, the controls, and it goes to enterprise risk level. And then the security operations, they deal with incident management, and they monitor the cyber attacks, and then resilience, we have business continuity and disaster recovery after a business impact analysis. So what is required is to go beyond risk assessments to fragility assessments and operational threat modeling with the inputs from these current technologies. And then that should help to create a cyber early warning system. And then after scenario planning and all these abductive thinking, you create a proactive cyber defense strategy. You find that resilience management is equally an important input to the proactive cyber defense strategy. Then it rolls up to the enterprise risk governance, and then it helps businesses to make better business decisions. So there is no siloed approach. Business, IT, security, they don't work in silos. They work together for understanding the business value that is created by the risk management and fragility management. So that's what I have. If you have any questions. Yes, Rabi. This is a new concept, and fragility assessment. So for industrial control systems, safety, the OT systems, they focus on like the oil and gas sector. They have fragility assessments, but they don't have this holistic view of threat modeling, fragility assessments, and cyber early warning systems. Cyber early warning system is something new to these concepts. So you'll find that we have to modify even our intrusion detection systems to this, because our probability-based thinking and approaches so far, they have to be modified to consider the unknown unknowns, which don't come within probability. So intrusion detection systems, which are based on signatures or even some behavioral analysis, they should have what is called the suspicion factor, not just the risk factor, the known factor, what is suspicious, what is possible. So this is a new approach, and that is still to be evangelized. It is just out of the research area. In fact, I am going at the end of this month to make my research presentation in Delft University in Netherlands. They have shown interest in this because it is a new area, and that conference is being organized by RAND Corporation. And RAND Corporation, you know, they are consultants to Department of Defense. Any other questions? Yes, Harvey. Yes, I already spoke to Isaac about the risk management failure part of it in the last conference. So after the Delft conference, certainly we'll get some more inputs and we can talk about that. I think we are short of time. Any other questions? Otherwise, thank you so much. Thank you.